my little speech on the ground protection rule strategy. I'm glad we were able to come up here. It's a beautiful library. It's amazing. I haven't been inside this before. And I appreciate, again, everybody coming and expressing your interest in this. What I'm going to do, the way I'm going to structure it, and I have it in the presentation, is I'm just going to walk through a PowerPoint presentation on the rule, so you have a bit of a background on what this rule does and doesn't do. And then we will go in a little bit further to the details of that. And so I'm going to sit through some of this because going back and forth, and I just want to be formal but casual. And do what I can with that. First of all, I'm Scott Stewart. I'm a hydrogeologist and groundwater coordinator for the state of Vermont. I've been doing that about 30 years now, so I've been around the block a little bit. What I'm doing today is I'm presenting the groundwater protection rule strategy. It's an existing rule that's being revised to make changes that have been needed for a number of years, and I'll get into the details as we go forward. In general, what I'm going to do is, again, go through this PowerPoint, then we're going to take formal comment on the rule itself, because that's really what we're looking for, is comment on the language of the rule. And then we're actually going to take that and then open it up for question and answers. So hopefully the PowerPoint itself is going to answer some of your questions, maybe not, in which case at the end we can have a more general discussion and try to answer some of your questions. Again, there may be some that I can or won't be able to answer. And then we'll end the meeting by 6 because they close the library.
I'm just wondering that, you're going to take comments before you take questions, and we might have comments to make once we have questions answered. Will that still be considered part of the comments?
Well, what I'm trying to distinguish is because there's a formal rulemaking process that we have to go through, and what we're doing, and the reason we have these public meetings is to actually take comment on the rule.
Right.
You can submit comments at any time.
So we can submit them after we get answers.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, isn't it like February 12th or something?
Yes, February 12th.
Oh, right there.
So we're taking comments at the close of business on the 12th. So, and there'll be more information as I go through the PowerPoint, and you can send the comments to me, and we will take those. So any written comments. So again, because of sake of time, or because of the details that you might have, emails, letters, whatever you want to send, and we'll take those in. But again, this is comments on the rule itself, and maybe not on, say, the implications of the rule so much, but it's how this rule is structured. So, continuing on, Chapter 48 is the legislature put together back in the 60s, and it's mainly to look at protecting groundwater in the state of Vermont. As part of that, we have a comprehensive groundwater management program that has 3 different parts. We have the groundwater protection rule strategy, which we're going to talk about tonight. That was updated in 2016 to include PFOA and PFOS. And then again, updated this year to include 3 other PFAS chemicals, which I'm assuming that you're at least somewhat familiar with, because it's been all over the news and everything. The other part of that is we have a groundwater management plan. It's a separate document for, again, managing our groundwater in Vermont. And then we have the Groundwater Coordinating Committee, which is a group of people that get together on a monthly basis. I'm the chair of that committee and have been for a number of years. And we provide discussion and forum for presenting issues related to groundwater to the secretary. Again, it's an advisory group. Again, the legislative chapter, it's 10 VSA, Vermont State Sanitated, Chapter 48. In 2008, one of the big changes that came out was that the legislature made groundwater a public trust resource. And that was also put in with the agency where I work, Agency of Natural Resources, is the trustee of that resource. At the time, Commissioner Mears issued an interim procedure in 2011 that was meant to be a bridge to incorporate public trust and how it's managed into our program until such time as we actually change the rules, which is what we're doing now, and that's what this rule is about, is incorporating that. And as it's stated, we're incorporating public trust principles, including revisions to the standards and the use of compliance, points of compliance, into the regulatory programs to ensure the protection of groundwater for present and future generations. So this is, again, taking public trust as a resource for everybody and making sure each of the various programs instill that or incorporate that into their rules. And again, this proposed rule applies to groundwater in Vermont. We have other rules that deal with surface water. This one is specific to groundwater. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to step through with the rest of these slides, cover the various subchapters within the rule. Again, it's a revision to the existing rule, which has roughly the same chapters, but some of them revised and changed a little bit. But in essence, what subchapter 1 does, it lays out that we manage 4 different classes of groundwater. We're setting up a process to reclassify groundwater. We provide standards for protection of groundwater quality, and each of the programs needs to revise their rules to incorporate groundwater protection initially within 5 years, and then every 7 years after that to make sure that we have the most up-to-date information and protections in place. The applicability of this rule is that it applies to all activities subject to the following rules and programs. So these 11 programs, and this is are incorporated or referenced under this rule. So this rule is an umbrella rule that covers each of these rules. Each of these rules is still in place, but this rule makes sure that groundwater protection is incorporated in each of these. And that includes the solid waste management rules, hazardous waste management, underground and above ground storage tanks, salvage yards, underground injection control, indirect discharge, stormwater, wastewater, as it relates to the wastewater system, and the remediation rules. Again, in subchapter 1, we deal with the 4 different classes of groundwater. If someone wants to reclassify groundwater, it takes a petition to do that. Essentially, all water in the state is considered class 3, which is you can use it for pretty much anything from agriculture, commercial, industrial, all basic uses. Class 2, which we only have one area designated in the state, is set aside as a higher protection, and class 1 is essentially uniform excellent character where it's pristine. So there may be some areas in the state that have areas that aren't at risk from anything, and they may be set aside for future uses, drinking water supplies or something like that. In order to do a class 1, you actually have to get the legislature involved, so that's why we don't have any at this point. But we do have a class 2, which is around one of our public water systems. And class 4 is the other class, and those are the contaminated sites, so UniFirst and some of the other ones, like the Barge Canal and other areas, have been designated. We only have about 20 of those in the state where they've been reclassified to this lower level designation. And mainly that's to protect the public and the environment within those areas, so that we're not going in and drilling new wells in an area that's already contaminated. So we're trying to protect those from getting worse. So in subchapter 3, we have, again, groundwater as a public trust. That calls out specific protections for public emergencies, for domestic and residential use, farming, dairy processing, potable and public water supplies, and geothermal that's non-extractive. So those types of activities or uses are set aside from the outset as being protected. And so they sort of, once they take precedence, but they're set aside as sort of the highest use that we have, for at least for use of groundwater. In the same subchapter, we have permit determinations. So this gets into dealing with permitted activities. So activities that are proposed for initial permitting or expansion must meet requirements to protect groundwater resources. The main components are that they will not result in exceedance of groundwater enforcement standards at the points of compliance, will not prevent future use of the groundwater for drinking water, will be consistent with the purpose of the source protection area or plan, if relevant, will not be inconsistent with the municipal groundwater overlay district, and will not otherwise adversely affect public trust uses. As part of that, we have a presumption of general compliance, and that is an activity is presumed to meet the requirements if the applicable agency rules require performance or technical standards or best management practices that reliably and consistently ensure that the requirements are met. And then again, the rules will be evaluated, each of the program rules will be evaluated within 5 years to make sure that all of those either BIPs or performance or technical standards are incorporated within those rules. So again, this is the overarching part where we're making sure that each of the different program rules that are listed have these components in them. Subchapter 4, we're looking at management of groundwater. So again, this is once an area has been reclassified. Again, class 3 area is by default whatever it's using. In class 1, again, it's sort of the most pristine area where there's no high or moderate potential risk activities. So there are no wastewater systems or stormwater hotspots within the area. Again, you could probably look at that as like mountaintops or valley bottoms or forest land where there's been no activity. Class 2, there are no high potential risk activities, but there may be some moderate risks. So you wouldn't have a solid waste landfill, you wouldn't have a hazardous waste treatment or disposal facility, you wouldn't be land applying biosolids or stabilized septic in the area in order to be able to classify that as a class 2. And the class 4, no potable or public water supplies are allowed in the class 4 area. Again, it's to protect anybody later in time coming in and trying to, say, put a well in a contaminated area, unless there's specific conditions being met. In subchapter 5, we have a reclassification process that gets into how to change the class. Either to a 4 or from 3 to 2 or 1. And we've clarified that process, streamlined it, and updated it. There's a list of who can apply, what needs to be in the petition. So anybody essentially can petition for land to be reclassified as long as they provide that information and submit it to us. The groundwater enforcement standards in subchapter 6 are the actual substances that we have set up as groundwater enforcement standards. They're based on information from the Department of Health, and there's a whole appendix that includes those. And the PFAS chemicals that were just added are added to that list along with a number of others that have been updated. We also have preventative action levels set up with those numbers. They are either 10% or 50% of that enforcement standard, and that's as an early warning system. So that if something, if there's a contaminant in groundwater and it reaches either 10 or 50% of that particular standard, say benzene, for example, then it's a way to monitor, is it increasing, decreasing? Certainly if it exceeds the preventative action level, then certain actions need to be taken to deal with that. The primary and secondary standards in the current rule have been consolidated into this one table, and the non-health-based standards have been removed. The compliance points that we talked about earlier is where the groundwater enforcement standard cannot be exceeded. And the compliance points may be drinking water sources, class 1, 2, or 4 boundaries, property boundaries, zone 2 of a public water source protection area, and for various other activities that are prescribed distances from those activities. So distance from a landfill, distance from, above ground, below ground fuel tank, etc. There's a list of those in the rule. So you might ask, what happens if we exceed one of those? So we have two different components. We have preventive action, which is when the preventive action level is exceeded at a compliance point. The permittee for that activity needs to submit a report with sample results and recommendations for action. So that before it gets to a critical level, they need to actually take action and let us know what they're going to do about it. And the unfortunate cases where an enforcement standard is exceeded, then we take corrective action, which is the permittee immediately notifies the agency, submits an initial report within 10 days of detection, and then a supplemental report within 30 days. And obviously there may be a lot of other actions taken along with that. And the Secretary may require the permittee to take action to remediate the contamination, including ceasing the activity, changing operation, providing treatment for affected sources of potable and public water. And that's the end of the rule. The next steps that we have right now are, we've already held 3 public meetings. This is the last one. The comment period ends on the 12th, and you're welcome to send comments to me. And here's my email address. We're at 1 National Life Drive in Montpelier. And the process after this, and after we take these comments, is that we will consolidate all the comments that we get. We'll do a responsiveness summary. We'll make revisions to the rule as needed, depending on what we find. We've already found a couple of typos, so we'll be fixing those. And then we file the draft the proposed rule with the legislative committee on rules. And then the legislature gets to weigh in on this process. And the big question you're asking is, why do we protect groundwater? Because of the kids and for future generations. So that's the overarching goal of this rule, is to make sure that we're protecting groundwater for now and into the future. So that's pretty much it for me talking right now. What I do want to do is open it up for any specific questions on that question. Sorry, so if anybody has comments, because I'm just assuming you've all read this, you've all read the rule, you've memorized it. There's a quiz at the end. Okay, just checking, so there's a quiz at the end. But if you have specific comments, not questions, but comments on the rule, we're happy to take those. Again, it's if they're typos or if you just have any sort of specific comments that go toward the rule, we're happy to take those. What I want to do is I just again try to make that a specific section, and then after that, I don't know how there are. I'm happy to open it up to question and answers, and again, we can get into that as a more general basis.
I have a question comment. I noticed in the bit where, and I can't remember what the number was of the section, but it was about biosolids, and the written piece put it in a column where it was harm-free. And I really question that because the biosolids, as I understand it, come from the landfill. They,
So
correct?
I think I might want to correct what you're saying. I think the section that was listed was that for a class 2 area.
Right.
If you're going to classify an area as a class 2 or a class 1, you can't have any of those activities in that area. And that, the example was you can't have land application of biosolids or septic in order to call it a class 2. So if someone wants to designate an area as a class 2, like Brandon's water supply system, they would have to show that they don't have land application of biosolids.
Okay.
So it's preventative. You can't do that if you're, land applying.
So there would be something that examines what is in a biosolid before it's spread on the land.
No, it would be, you can't classify this as a class 2 area if you're land applying any sort of biosolids or septic. So
That's what class 2.
that activity stops you from making it a class 2 area. So I just wanted to have the comments for that. So, comment on the rule?
Well, just a clarification of that, can you farm in a class 2 area?
Can you what?
Can you farm? Is it, so a class 2 area, can you have it for agricultural use?
Yes. Right? Yes.
So therefore, you can't apply a biosolid to that area that you're farming if it contains too much PFOA?
Well, so again, we're getting into specifics. Can I just come back to that one for a second?
Sure.
Okay.
I have a more general question.
Okay, so again, just before we break, does anybody have an actual comment on the language in the rule? Okay, because I'd like to get to the comments as opposed to the questions we can.
Scott, maybe if you have a comment, you can give the example, but I'd like to see what an example of a comment would be.
I have a change of language that I would like to see. I would just like you to change the word may to will.
Secretary
The
will.
secretary may initiate remediation or, I mean, it says this throughout all of these rules, which makes it sound as if it's discretionary to the secretary to actually take any action if there's contamination of groundwater. I would like to see that changed to will take action.
Okay, we will note that and look at that.
So that's an
May means nothing.
Well, May does allow discretion.
Yeah,
And we try to have that kind of discussion in the
Well,
rules.
yeah.
So, again, that's the
This is related to comments too. There is some specification in things like, well, this is what class 3 allows, this is what, and then assuming that this is what class 4 does not allow. That's kind of one of the things I'm wondering about the discretion that's needed if we are looking at the public trust, because that was one of the main goals in changing or updating the rules, is to add and incorporate that public trust. Then that's something I'm wondering about, and if there would be, because we are looking at emerging substances, if there would be the precautionary principle taking some value to changing, the rules and putting that in there that would allow for the current and future generations and the public trust to be seen as, really seriously considered.
Okay,
So precautionary principle, that's something that I think is pretty vague anyway, and so maybe that wouldn't be specific enough, but it would make the whole comment about we're doing this for public trust for future generations. We're looking at the future, we're knowing things can change, and we are going to be acting today on precautionary principles and being prepared to maybe not allow activities that could theoretically and in history have caused problems with drinking water.
right, okay. So again, we take that as a comment.
Okay.
Does anybody else have? So,
I don't know if this qualifies, but I'll try again. what seems to be absent from the rule is anything about who's testing and when is the testing occurring periodically to determine if preventive action or corrective action is needed.
Okay, so the first piece, like the first slide or two that I showed, talks about the applicability of the rule. So again, what this rule does is it makes sure that the public trust test is incorporated in each of those 11 different rules. So each of those programs then needs to look at their rule, and they're either doing it now or they need to revise their rules within the 5-year window to make sure that they're doing that. So that would be a program specific. Answer to your question would be whether each of those rules has the requirements for testing, sampling, evaluation of it, and each of those rules does have that in different ways. Like stormwater has it in certain ways, and above ground fuel tanks has things in their rules too. So again, what this is doing is this isn't a program-specific rule, other than it makes sure that public trust, in the general sense of us trying to be careful with what happens and how to protect for the future, those principles are in this rule and says to all these other 11 rules, you need to have those standards addressed in your rules. So it doesn't actually, each program has to then look at their own rules to make those changes. So again, we're viewing this, one way to view this is a very high-level rule and doesn't have program-specific details in it. It just points to each of those rules and says each of those rules needs to have the details to address the public trust piece. So I'm not going to be able to answer a lot of detailed questions because the nature of this rule is to make sure that on sort of a global or large scale across the department, each of the programs is addressing what they need to address. Yeah.
I believe it was in subchapter 3 in the permitting rules. There was a question, will not prevent future use for drinking water. It's particularly relevant here. Drinking water for whom? Because our Medwayman for Maygo, for example, is not a drinking water source for us, but it is for almost 200,000 Canadians. So it doesn't specifically address that. I would like to see that in there.
It says public, but it doesn't say whether it's Canadian public or, yeah.
So, first of all, this rule deals with groundwater,
Okay.
and so it doesn't deal with surface water. So I said that to start with. So this rule deals with protecting groundwater. The resource is groundwater. So impacts to surface water are dealt with in other rules. Understand this rule is for groundwater, and to that extent, it deals with public water supplies that are groundwater derived.
Okay.
So like the town of Newport's well and things like that would be groundwater.
Right. Plainfield, but not Montpelier, which is surface water. So, okay, sorry, so you had a question? Sorry. I know we're veering off, I'm trying to answer your questions, but I just want to make sure, so are these still?
This is a comment.
Okay.
This is a comment.
Perfect.
In the definitions, you have a definition for Vermont action levels,
Yes.
which are what you described with the chemicals.
Yep.
But you never define the groundwater enforcement standard or the preventive action level. Those aren't in the definitions.
Because they're in chapter 6, that essentially the standards are based on either MCLs that EPA has developed or the health advisories that the health department has developed. And those, in one combination or another, it's an MCL, EPA MCL, we default to that. That becomes the groundwater enforcement standard. If EPA doesn't have an MCL, and the health department has a health advisory level assigned to that chemical, then that becomes the enforcement standard. And then in addition to that, we have the preventative action level, which is, as I said, 10% or 50% of that value as an early
I
warning.
think it's how it's 10 or 50.
It's based on the type of chemical, and it's,
And each one has its design.
each has its
own.
own based on the toxicity. Yeah. So, so yes, there isn't a definite definition in the definitions, but it's called out in, I think, the beginning of some chapter 6.
So I have a question. So these rules get, every 5 years get updated or are looked at every 5 years?
So one of the things that this rule does, as well as some of our other rules, is this sets a initial 5-year evaluation window. So within the next 5 years, programs that maybe haven't opened their rules up in a while or haven't had a chance to put in the most current practices will need to do that and make sure that they're addressing this rule and the public trust piece in the next 5 years. And then after that 5-year window, it moves out to a 7-year cycle where the rules will still come back through for review over the next 7 years. So some programs have rules that they haven't changed in like 10 years or 20 years, and some other ones, even like this one, other ones, they change on a more frequent basis. And a lot of times that's to capture new information, or like with this one where we're updating enforcement standards.
I just think it with all of the new contaminants and all of the new health advisories for the contaminants that we're just now recently finding out, 5 years is a very long time.
So,
So the 5-year
so
kind of concerns me.
yeah. So to answer that and to be clear about that is the program rules need to evaluate their rules within that time frame. The standards in the back, the appendix list of chemicals, we can address those at any time. And so we did that with PFOA and PFOS, and we did it with the PFOS. Essentially our process is we go to emergency rulemaking and we immediately have those new standards added in or the new chemical added in, and that's a process that we can do. We're in right now, and we can do it any time going forward. So that's a separate process from programs just reviewing their rules. So hopefully that takes care of that.
I looked at your chapter 6, and what you said, establish a groundwater enforcement standard, says the secretary adopts and establishes the groundwater enforcement standards. I don't know what that means.
So
Is there another place where it is? Because I'd like to know where those groundwater enforcement standards came from, that you're taking 50% and 10% out for the prevented action.
So they come from the Department of Health, which combines either EPA's numbers, as I said. So if there's an EPA MCL,
What's it? Could you say MCL? Could you?
MCL is a maximum contaminant level.
Maximum contaminant level.
Yeah.
Now, I was under the impression that the EPA, like for the PFAS specifically, was a lifetime health advisory limit, that they didn't really have it.
So again,
Just trying to understand the table, and I'm saying that I don't think there's enough information in here for me to understand the table, I guess.
So
It's a comment on the document.
yep, and we'll certainly take a look at that. I need to figure out where some of this is defined. But the health department does two things: is if EPA has a value, then we use that value. If there isn't a value, like EPA hasn't come up with a value for PFAS or any of those chemicals, the health department can define those standards, and that's called health advisory. That is then put into the table, and then both of those are used as the enforcement standard going forward. So they're, right, they're probably somewhat so under 33 in the page 11, Vermont action levels. The definition there is that means that merit guidelines reached and derived by the Vermont Department of Health for particular chemicals that have a maximum contaminant level promulgated by the EPA and are of specific health interest as determined by the Vermont Department of Health. Now that's a specific group, but it gets in general that we're, standards come from the health department.
There were only very few of the chemicals that had a Vermont action level.
Yeah, they're only about 10, and because those are specific to drinking water supplies, as opposed to just general groundwater.
So the PFAS chemicals are not applicable to drinking water because they have no Vermont action level?
They're applicable to groundwater. And so, drinking water is a subset of groundwater. So if there is contamination of a drinking water supply, these enforcement standards would apply. But the thing is, we also have the water supply rule, which is a separate rule that has its own standards for drinking water. And those, again, come from the health department and from EPA. And so it's confusing, but we have two separate rules with very similar standards, but they're adopted under different authorities.
Can you see how that might be confusing for someone reading this?
Yes, but we also have...
Maybe you can work on clarifying it. Thank you.
Yeah. We also have a lot of rules that somewhat overlap and sometimes don't overlap, and so we just naturally have a lot of rules. Try to do the best we can. Thank you for that. Yes.
So I know that this was kind of hit upon in a general way to change the may to the will, but in the case that that doesn't happen, I specifically would like to have under the background groundwater quality section 5C, the secretary may consult with the groundwater coordinating committee prior to making the final decision. I would definitely like to see that be built. That the secretary would check with the coordinating committee prior to making a final decision.
We can certainly take a look at that and put that in. Again, the legislature set up the groundwater coordinating committee as an advisory group to provide comment and advice to the secretary.
Right.
It's still up to the secretary to do, to decide to take action or not. But again, our group mainly discusses the issues and then, if need be, provides advice to the secretary.
But it would be good for the secretary to consult with that committee if you are indeed experts and would have an opinion on this stuff. To the public, it feels better than having one person have all the power. It just doesn't feel right to us.
Right.
So having a committee that's an advisory committee look at something as important as that, I think would be important.
Yeah, again, it's set up to do that, but we can certainly look at the language around that.
I think I was also, go ahead.
So just, you have one more?
My other comment is that I don't think property boundaries should be used for enforcement action. If you give somebody a buffer zone into a wetland and there's potential for the water supply that's on the other side of that buffer zone, but they don't meet the enforcement action because they're still on their property per se for that next 50 or so feet or 100 feet. I think that leaves a lot to be desired to an entity or to, that's not ensuring public trust. I don't agree with that one at all. I don't think property boundaries should convey how you would enforce or possible contamination. Do you understand what I'm saying? Maybe I'm not saying it. You're looking.
Well, I do, but I'm not.
Well, no.
But your comment is that you think something other than property boundaries should be used.
Oh, definitely, especially when it comes to groundwater supplies and that go into lakes and,
Okay.
feed out elsewhere.
Well, I had a question because of going back to the different rules and the different interplay between the committees influencing the secretary or the rules that you talked about being different. If there's, of course, we're concerned in this area too with solid waste rules because of the landfill and proximate to the Lake Winnebago and the wetlands here. So I'm just curious if there's any, if there's any variance in standards or interpretations of standards, then what has the final say? I mean, yours is just a groundwater rule, and then there's a surface water rule, and then there's maybe solid waste rules, and then there, it just seems like there's so many rules, perhaps in Vermont, that you're not going to be able to, know which one really is the governing rule in this case.
Well, in this case, the standards, the groundwater enforcement standards are the standard for groundwater in the state. And then we have other programs that deal with the water quality standards that deal with surface water in the state. So this has a standard for groundwater.
The groundwater does,
Flow into
flow
the
into
surface
the
water.
surface water, like the
Right.
Black River,
Right.
Winnebago.
And this rule addresses contamination of groundwater and movement of groundwater
It does.
Into receptors, I think.
into
you call it
receptors. And the receptors being, again, groundwater sources, that would be drinking water supplies, or class 1 or 2 areas, or the other things that I mentioned. So and these standards are specific to those as receptors.
Okay.
But is it only to groundwater as receptors?
Yes, because these are groundwater standards.
But if the groundwater goes into something that's not a groundwater receptor, but is a river or a lake,
Then it would be addressed under the other programs,
And
rules
that's-
that deal with surface water.
And that's what I guess my question was related to, is like, what kind of, interplay is there that's really, in making the rules? We make the rules with the surface people so that we're all on the same, page.
Yes, and that's a goal that we have. So again, we're sort of stepping off comments on the rule, but, we certainly recognize that it's, but it's a fluid resource, and that there is movement. And so but we can only develop rules based on the authority that we're given. And the legislature gives us the authority for specific things, and at this point, we have rules that deal with groundwater.
Okay, I just.
And then we have rules that deal with surface water, and they may or may not have the same standard. Just because the nature of the two different things is, once you get surface water, things change, they transport, pollution, a bunch of other things change that may be a factor, but may be less of a factor in groundwater, or more of a factor in groundwater. So again, we're sort of bound with drawing this line. We realize the line is blurry, but we can only work within sort of the framework that we're given.
I guess then a comment would be that there would be references in the groundwater rules to have, mention of, as opposed to the surface water rules, as opposed to the whatever other kind of rules they have across Vermont that could be relevant.
Okay, we can certainly
I mean, that's probably
look at.
maybe even done before, but, and my other question was on the classifications. So there's one place in Vermont that's at the second classification.
Class 2,
Where's that?
that's granted,
Brandon?
Why?
because they chose to apply to, or petition to have that area reclassified, because they're, want to make sure that they can protect it going, additional protections going forward in the future. They have a source protection area, but they also then want to have this as a class 2 area, so that they could get better protected for the future. And that's sort of the reason or the goal of having a class 2 or class 1 area, is so that towns, cities, water systems, whoever can decide that if they have land, that they say, hey, you know what, we've got a very productive aquifer here, or we have certain land that we don't want to develop right now, we want to use it for public supply in the future, we can do that. And it's a way to set land aside to say, here's an area that we want to protect for the future, we can do that. And by setting it out as a class 2 area, you're able to do that, or a class 1. And then the flip side again is if we have areas that are contaminated that we know about, the 20 or so that we have, we can say, you know what, this is not a good place to put a well or develop a spring or do something where someone's going to be contaminated. So we set that aside.
Can you give a few examples of which areas in Vermont are class 4?
Yeah, I mean, UniFirst in Williamstown, I mean, they developed a whole new water supply that I permitted years ago because the UniFirst contamination was in the area, and they ended up connecting a whole bunch of systems, a whole bunch of homes to the new water system because the ground under was contaminated. I think probably the Barge Canal in Burlington, Pine Street. So most of your Superfund sites, most of your major areas can be or have been defined as class 4s, and that's just one option in trying to sort of set that land aside so that people aren't doing well. So to give you all, take a breath, right? At least I'll take a breath. If there are any more specific comments on the rule, I mean, we sort of veered off into answering questions anyway, and we've got a few minutes left that I can burn, 13 minutes maybe, or less. My math is wrong. They didn't have any math skills, so whatever time we have left. Isn't that a great picture?
It is a great.
Sorry, I'm distracted.
Anybody who knows
Who's
this?
that?
That's my grandson.
Oh, that's
Thank you. Yeah.
That is a verbal kill. Are you Scottish?
Yes,
Oh, yes, of course.
yes. Yeah, he's a McGregor steward,
Oh, my God.
so we got on both sides. Yes.
So I guess I have a question. How does the DEC or A&R rationalize being able to protect groundwater when they don't even do their own testing? They take the entities or whoever, they don't test themselves, they don't collect samples, they just basically take the test results from whoever and it's submitted into the state. So that's a really confusing thing for me. That's a big trust issue as far as I'm concerned.
I understand that, obviously, being in the drinking water program for as many years as I have. We deal with that all the time. I mean, when I first started at the health department back in the day, we had, it was our staff that went out and took samples for public community water supply systems. The problem is that that's not, one, it's not really financially viable. We don't have the staff, we don't have the time because of all the samples that need to be taken on all the different projects. And that's just drinking water. So now if you're talking solid waste, hazardous waste, if you're talking any other entity, we have to rely on contractors and consultants and their reputations, PEs and hydrologists to do the work. And that's why people hire consulting firms. That's why you hire well drillers. That's why you hire plumbers. You have to essentially put some faith in the plumber you're hiring to fix your your septic system or your pipes in your basement is going to do a decent job. We all know, through the world, they're good contractors and they're not so good contractors, and they're good PEs and not so good at PEs. So we do the best we can, but we have to rely on professionals to do the work that they're hired to do to give us the results that we need. And a lot of times that is the permitted activity. The permit owner may have to hire somebody to do the work. But again, we have staff that review the results that come in, and if they don't have certified labs, or if they're not done in the way they're supposed to, that's our job. And our job is to make sure that the consultants that we work with are giving us the information that we need to make the right decisions around whether action needs to be taken or not. So again, I can wait on the longer answers, but
This is kind of a follow-up because you mentioned in there that you know, the best management practices are used, and that would be an example, and it's in reliably and consistently meet standards. And I've often wondered, you know, what are the standards for numbers of tests that should be taken at a, you know, site that's had some PFAs be seen in exceedance or at anything. It sometimes, you know, I know they're tested once or twice a year, different wells, but to me that doesn't seem like very much, again, not knowing what it is. So what's your...
I would defer to this specific program. I work in the drinking water program, so I'm not going to speak for solid waste or hazardous waste or other people. I work with them a lot, but I'm not familiar with their programs. Some programs have, I mean, from drinking water, depending on the type of system, you know, if we're talking, you know, a restaurant, say, versus Montpelier or the city of Newport, they may be on completely different schedules. They're going to test for things, but it may be a smaller list for like a restaurant and less frequent than if we're talking Newport, you know, Montpelier, Plainfield, whatever. They're on a lot higher schedule. So it's the programs, a lot of times it's based on what EPA requires. So in the drinking water program, EPA is very specific, and there's a federal register this thick that tells you exactly how often, when, and what to test for, and we have to follow that. And so, again, there's a lot of scientific, you know, basis put into how frequently something gets monitored or not. And again, it's going to depend on the chemicals.
It's like a wastewater treatment plant. That wouldn't you be testing in your area for that to see what the effluent was because it's going to be in drinking water?
Well, we try not to have our wastewater go into the drinking water,
Okay.
but that's also a test for things. And so there are requirements in the wastewater program that say how often you need to test for things.
So if an entity has a chronic history of failing to test or failing to give test results, when does enforcement, like there's no specific, it's all at the discretion of the secretary, or?
No, I mean, that's from the drinking water program. I spent my career dealing with systems that are recalcitrant, to put it nicely, other ones that just, you know, it's the reality, and we deal with that. But that's also why we have an enforcement process, why we issue NOAVs, notices of alleged violations, we issue assurance of discontinuance. I mean, we have a whole, you know, enforcement program that is there to address those. And when they rise, you know, to our attention, we then, you know, work with our, you know, operations people, our enforcement people, and we pass those referrals off on a continual basis. You know, Montpelier has line leaks. You probably saw it in the news just this past weekend. They had two. They're on boil water notice until they sample enough samples to then come off the boil notice. So we have a process that, and again, in this case, can speak for other programs, that all of our other programs have these same capabilities and the same review process to say, hey, if you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing, we're going to go after you. And you see that in the news at different times where we have settlements from different programs. St. Cobain just settled, you know, down south for, we're going to now pay for, you know, water lines to go in. And that's a settlement based on them having contamination down there. So our wheels grind slowly, but they do grind. And, you know, I can say that for all these years. Oh, that just, so you're.
So I'm wondering if background levels, contaminant levels haven't been determined, and there have been exceedances of the groundwater enforcement standards detected, that should automatically then trigger these actions where reports have to be filed right away, and then actions are going to be decided in that. Is that correct?
Yeah, if there's an exceedance of a standard.
And there's been no, they couldn't explain it away as a background contaminant if those have not been established?
Well, so if there's an exceedance, say,
Yes.
just, I'm going to use a hypothetical, but just, if there's an exceedance of some chemical above the PAL, to go back to the early warning.
Well, let's say primary, above primary.
Well, So I'm just gonna
Okay.
use it so, again, as I point out, so if they exceed the preventative action level at a point of compliance, then the program would evaluate that and say, you know, what's going on here, and they would have them provide information to us, whether it's additional sampling or whatever, to see, you know, is it going up, is it going down, they might have sampling more frequently, whatever. If it exceeds,
What if it's exceeded for years?
well, well, the PAL is, and that may be the case, because, we have that happen with our drinking water systems, and I'll use examples I'm familiar with. So in drinking water systems, we have systems where, say it's radio counts, uranium or radon or something like that, where some of the substances, like the radioactive ones, we actually sample it over 4 quarters. So we make them sample each quarter because you need to sort of look at the average, because those kind of chemicals, as opposed to say manganese. Manganese is pretty much, if you have it, you know it, you've got it, and it stays generally fairly consistent if you've been have it for a while. And that's common throughout the state. Radio counts, they can fluctuate. So you need sort of a running average to say, do we really need to take action? Because you can have a level that's at, say, 15, but the next one could be at 3. And the next one's at 0.05. And then the next one's at 15 again. So until you get to the reliably, consistently over a certain average or certain level, do you need to take action? So we have a lot of systems where we've just been monitoring them over time. You know, nitrates being one. Are you new septic systems? Well, are you adding new septic systems in the area? So a lot of this gets into program-specific judgment and evaluation of what's happening with that specific chemical.
So it's where it can be subjective.
We try not to make it subjective. It's either you either test and find it, you find it at a certain level, but the thing you may need to do, and what our programs do spend a lot of time doing, is trying to evaluate where is it coming from, what's happening to it. Again, when we get into like spills or releases of chemicals, is, okay, is it a plume? Is it moving? How fast is it moving? How far is it moving? Is it dispersing? Is it decreasing? Is it increasing? So again, we can change our sampling program and criteria based on how fast or slow that's moving. If things are trending up, we tend to jump on that and say, hey, you know what, you need either more frequent sampling, or you need to take action, or you need to call in a specialist, or do whatever. That's the corrective action. That's where we say, you need to do something now with this. And then other times where it's decreasing, we can say, you know what, we don't need to monitor it every month. We can do it quarterly, we can go to yearly. So again, we do that with our systems all the time, where it's not subjective, but it's based on the conditions that we see. And to get your point about background, is one of the things we may want to do in a case like that is look at, well, is this, you know, background level? Because if the background level is already exceeded the standard by naturally occurring, well, you still exceeded the standard, but it may not be the fault of, you know, party A. It's because most bedrock in Vermont has iron, manganese, nitrates, arsenic. I mean, there are a bunch of things that we have a lot of naturally occurring chemicals that are there because of the geology. What you need to tease out is how much of this is coming from, you know, say the permanent activity versus the naturally occurring piece.
And so a way to determine that is watching it, whether it goes up and down or is increasing over time, that kind of thing. Would say it's not background.
Or looking at the site conditions. I mean, if you're near a reducing environment, you know, depending on the chemistry, and again, it seems like I can lay down for a long time on this stuff, but it depends on the site conditions. So you may have an area that is a more reducing environment, which then mobilizes iron, manganese, you know, other chemicals more easily than, say, a mountaintop or, you know, something that's got a lot of clay in it. So it's all dependent on the situation. So again, we would look at that and say, okay, where do we think this is coming from?
Thank you.
For a while, and I don't know, it may still be going on, sludge that was coming out of waste management was being sprayed on fields because people felt at that time it would be great fertilizer. And now we know that the sludge component contains even more PFOAs than what's coming out in the liquid. And so when that's sprayed on farm fields and goes into the groundwater, who's asking anybody who's had a farm that's been sprayed with this stuff to check and see how much PFOA is in the groundwater there? And obviously, it went into the crops, it went into the cows that ate some of the crops, or the humans that ate some of those crops. Who is going to look at that and control it?
So we have programs that, certainly for biosolids, is that your
I'm sorry.
So we have, it'd probably be our indirect discharge program would be the program that permits land application of biosolids. So,
Scott, I think we should, the thing is, like, we can't answer that question here.
yeah,
That question is best directed at the program that's managing that, but here, we're principally here to talk about the urban architectural strategy. And I think your question really gets to other topics.
Okay, and the program you said that manages that is called?
indirect discharge.
I'm sorry, once again?
Indirect discharge.
Okay, thank you.
So, thanks everybody, at 6 o'clock, I hate to break it off, but
Thank you.